In 1938, the world map seemed complete. However, in the offices of the German regime, one idea was repeated. There were still corners to exploit. One of them was the southernmost part of the planet. There lay Antarctica, distant, difficult, but linked to something very specific, the whale fat that Germany needed for its industry. Hermann Göring was in charge of the 4-year plan. His mission was to prepare the economy for a long war. That meant steel, synthetic fuels, and also oils and fats. Much of these resources came through imports, and suppliers could be allies today and enemies tomorrow. That is why attention shifted to the South Atlantic and its whaling fleets. The archives recorded the central objective to study their own whaling fleet, evaluate support ports in the South Atlantic, and analyze whether a sector of Antarctica could serve as a future logistical base. Nothing in those papers mentioned underground fortresses. They did mention tons of oil and strategic independence. The expedition was organized quickly. The selected ship was the Schwabenland. It was not a warship. It was a vessel converted to launch and recover seaplanes. Catapults were installed on its deck. On board traveled 2 Dornier Walls, meteorologists, cartographers, photographers, and officers. The expedition depended on the Ministry of Aviation, which increased the secrecy. In December 1938, the Schwabenland set sail from Hamburg. Tensions were rising in Europe. Germany had already annexed Austria and the Sudetenland. It was preparing its next step. To the south, a team sailed in silence, carrying no cannons. They carried cameras, measuring instruments, and flags with the swastika. The plan was clear: reach the coast of Queen Maud Land and photograph as much as possible. During the journey, a key maneuver was tested: launching the Dornier from the catapult, flying over open sea, returning, landing next to the ship, and hoisting it aboard with a crane. There were no airfields or safe ports. If anything went wrong, a plane could be lost in the middle of the ice. This routine was practiced again and again. It was the technical foundation of the expedition. On January 19, 1939, the Schwabenland reached the Antarctic coast. Before the crew rose a white wall, ice barriers, platforms dropping into frozen cliffs. This was where the flights began. Each sortie followed a pattern: take off, cross the coastline, systematically photograph strips of ice, rocks, and mountains, and return to the ship. The cameras mounted on the seaplanes were the scientific heart of the mission. They worked with rolls of film capable of capturing long strips of the landscape. These images, when stitched together, would produce new maps. The pilot maintained a steady course. The observer recorded approximate coordinates. The photographer fired at regular intervals. Beneath the plane, Antarctica became a sequence of black and white rectangles. During the flights, another element was also deployed: aluminum arrows with small flags. They fell onto the ice and stuck in the snow. These were symbolic markers. They indicated that Germany had flown over that area. They were not formal occupation markers. They were a political gesture in the midst of an imperial race. In Berlin, thoughts were already on future agreements over polar territories. In the spring of 1939, the Schwabenland returned to the Northern Hemisphere. It carried thousands of photographs and notebooks full of numbers, and it carried a set of coordinates defining a new sector on the Antarctic coast. That sector would later receive a name. It would become the center of many later fantasies. Until then, it was simply a geographic discovery traced with straight lines on a map. Neuschwabenland, a new territory on the maps. The material brought back by the Schwabenland was not just a stack of photographs. It was a proposal to reorder the map of the far south. German cartographers sat in front of the images and began drawing lines between 2 well-defined meridians off the coast of Queen Maud Land. There they sketched a polygon. This polygon was named Neuschwabenland. The name was no accident. It referred to Swabia, a region in southern Germany, aiming to link the icy territory to the industrial heart of the Reich. The reports described the area with precision: a coastal strip with ice barriers, inland plateaus, mountain ranges peeking through glaciers. The white continent ceased to be a vague curve. It now had boundaries, names, and coordinates. The flights had followed a rigid method. Each mission covered a strip of terrain. The pilot maintained course and altitude, the navigator calculated positions with sextant and chronometer, and the photographer operated the photogrammetric camera. The machine captured images at regular intervals, each shot recording a swath of land. The idea was simple: overlay the photos, measure angles and distances, and convert the sequence into relief maps. In parallel, the observer dropped aluminum arrows with small flags. They were not large structures. They were lightweight pieces placed at selected points. In theory, they marked presence. In practice, few would survive wind, snow, and the passing seasons. Their value was more symbolic than practical, serving to signal that Germany had been there before anyone else. With the material on land, technicians calculated the approximate extent of Neuschwabenland, several 100,000 square kilometers, a surface comparable to that of a medium-sized European country. Many areas were inaccessible from the coast. Reaching them would require sleds, longer-range planes, or inland bases. None of that yet existed. The region was recorded more as a future possibility than as a controlled space. In Berlin, the discovery had multiple interpretations. For the Luftwaffe, it demonstrated technical capability, planes operating under extreme conditions and long-range aerial photography. For economic planners, it opened a scenario, a sector of the Antarctic coast where factory ships could operate if circumstances allowed. For propaganda, it offered a simple message. Germany also had its sector in the White Continent. In the following months, the regime's priorities shifted. In March 1939, it occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. In September, it invaded Poland. Attention focused on the land war in Europe. The newly named Antarctic sector was relegated to the background. No new expeditions were sent, no permanent meteorological stations were installed. Neuschwabenland, in practice, became just another name on a list of frozen ambitions. Still, the concept survived Germany's defeat. In the post-war years, some maps continued to mark Neuschwabenland. German toponymy blended with Norwegian and British names. In collections of nautical charts and polar atlases, the term kept appearing. For geographers, it was merely a historical reference. For conspiracy writers, however, it became the perfect setting to imagine what never existed. The photographic archive of the expedition played a key role in this transition. Many images were scattered, some were lost in bombings, others ended up in the hands of intelligence services or scientific institutes. Decades later, several were recovered and analyzed carefully. Among them, one striking feature can be recognized: a strip of land almost free of ice, with dark hills and mirrored pools of water. This visual anomaly seemed to break the uniformity of the landscape. It was not a secret base, it was a natural accident. But its characteristics would later be enough to fuel all kinds of interpretations. The Schirmacher oasis, land and water in the middle of the ice. The seaplane flew over a monotonous landscape, ice, more ice, blue shadows, low clouds. The horizon seemed never to change. Beneath the Dornier's wings, the continent appeared as a white sheet. In the cockpit, pilot Richard Schirmacher kept to the set course. It was just one of the scheduled flights to complete the mapping of the sector. At one point during the flight, something caught his attention. A dark spot broke the continuity of white. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a play of shadows on the ice surface, but as they approached, the spot grew. It was not dirty ice. It was rocks, bare hills, and among them glimmered small, smooth surfaces. They looked like mirrors. The plane descended slightly, just enough to get better images without compromising safety. The cameras began to fire. Frame after frame captured an unexpected phenomenon, a stretch of land almost free of ice, dozens of liquid water lakes, open surfaces contrasting with the surrounding ice mass. From the air, the landscape formed a kind of rock island in the white ocean. There were no human structures, no traces of construction, just hills, water, and patches of snow. In a continent dominated by extreme cold, this area suggested a more complex dynamic: localized geological heat, dry winds, distinct microclimatic conditions. Upon returning to the Schwabenland, the photos were carefully reviewed. Technicians realized it was not a small anomaly. It was a belt of rocky terrain extending for several kilometers, with lakes lined up like beads. Each basin was a potential object of future study. Each body of water could preserve climatic records in its sediments. In the expedition's reports, the discovery was clearly documented: an ice-free zone between the coast and the interior, a set of lakes surrounded by hills. The name that would eventually stick did not come from Berlin, but it would retain a trace of who first saw it. That sector would later become known as the Schirmacher Oasis. What had been a geographic surprise for the explorers would become a natural laboratory for science. Decades later, Soviet, Indian, and other international expeditions would return, landing planes on that strip, installing research stations, measuring water temperature, sediment composition, and lake-level variations. The focus was no longer on flags, it was on data. The existence of an Antarctic oasis with exposed liquid water has a physical explanation. Solar radiation heats the dark rock more than the ice. The accumulated heat melts the surrounding snow. Katabatic winds, cold but very dry, sweep away moisture and prevent the water from freezing immediately. The result is a series of ponds and lakes that persist during the summer. In winter, many are covered with ice, but the system endures. This combination of elements was fertile ground for the imagination: a rocky strip, liquid water, a somewhat less hostile climate, and easier potential access to the subsurface. All of this could be portrayed as an ideal setting for hidden refugees. The reality was less dramatic. An Antarctic oasis is a geographic rarity, not a secret passage. Yet the words oasis and discovered by the Germans would take on a life of their own outside academic circles. Over time, the Schirmacher oasis became a key site for legitimate human activity in Antarctica. Stations such as Novolazarevskaya, operated by the Soviet Union, and other temporary bases were established there. East Germany also built its Georg Forster station in the area during the height of the Cold War. Cabins, antennas, and laboratories occupied the place that, in other stories, had been reserved for bunkers. An archive of 11,600 photographs. The Schwabenland did not return with just coordinates and technical notes. It brought a silent treasure, roll after roll of film, 11,600 aerial photographs. A unique visual archive of the recently overflown Antarctic sector. As soon as the ship returned, another phase of work began. The negatives were developed in laboratories prepared for photogrammetric material. Technicians handled the strips with gloves. Each frame was numbered. Each series was associated with a flight, a date, and an approximate time. The information became a system. The goal was clear: to transform images into maps. The photos were placed on special tables and stereoscopic devices were used. By viewing two overlapping frames, the relief emerged: mountains, valleys, and cliffs. This three-dimensional vision allowed heights and distances to be calculated with considerable precision for the time. Cartographers drew lines on transparent sheets, cut out silhouettes of mountain ranges, outlined coasts or ice cliffs, and marked possible routes between prominent points. Each proposed name for a peak or plateau came from this combination: photo, measurement, drawing, a slow process but effective. The material was not kept in a single location. Some remained in naval archives. Other parts went to Luftwaffe offices. Copies were sent to geographic institutes. They were also used in internal conferences on exploration capabilities and the economic potential of the South Atlantic. From the start, the archive was dispersed. Then total war arrived. Bombings, office evacuations, hurried transfers of documents. Many photographs were lost in the chaos. Some remained in uncatalogued boxes. Others ended up mixed with unrelated files. There was no priority to preserve material from an expedition that, on the surface, held no immediate military value. After 1945, the Allies encountered remnants of that archive. They interrogated officers, searched basements and storage rooms, and seized boxes of maps and photographs. Anything that could shed light on what Germany had done in the South Atlantic and the polar territories was of interest. These materials were added to already vast collections in London, Washington, and Moscow. For years, the collection remained fragmented. Only a few maps were known within small circles. Among them, one working document stood out: a map created by the cartographer Proischow, which synthesized part of the mission's results. On the paper appeared mountain ranges with German names, lines marking the flight paths, and shaded areas indicating photographic zones that were still poorly defined. This map, along with others like it, served as a basis for later corrections. When Norwegians and British remapped the region in the post-war period, they consulted these documents, compared positions, and adjusted coordinates with new field measurements. Many proposed names were preserved with slight modifications. Others were replaced by local alternatives. The German imprint remained, but it did not dominate the toponymy. Meanwhile, the bulk of the 11,600 photographs remained in obscurity. Only decades later did some historians and polar specialists begin systematically tracking the archive. They consulted catalogues, cross-referenced records, and located boxes that had not been opened in years. As complete series were reunited, the expedition's route began to emerge clearly. The result was revealing. It became possible to reconstruct, flight by flight, in considerable detail, what order the sector's strips were covered, which peaks were photographed from different angles, and what Queen Maud Land's coast looked like in 1939. Comparing these images with modern photographs also provided a valuable tool for studying changes in glaciers and ice shelves. Mountains with German names. When the cartographers finished organizing the expedition's photographs, another lasting trace emerged: the names. Each prominent peak, each recognizable mountain range, and every rocky outcrop received a designation. Many recalled crew members, scientists, or figures from the regime. It was a simple way to leave a mark in a territory where nothing yet bore human signs. Among these features, one of the most cited is Habermehl Peak. In the original photos, it appeared as a rock needle emerging from the ice, a useful reference point for plotting aerial routes and delimiting sectors. In the working documents, it was recorded with approximate coordinates and a brief description. Decades later, Norwegian expeditions would confirm its position and nature. This was not an isolated case. Peaks and ranges received names such as Juristskavet, a deformation of a previous German name, or compound designations blending Germanic terms with descriptive words. In some cases, the original toponyms were preserved almost intact. In others, they were adapted to the spelling of the new Norwegian or British maps. Antarctica is a palimpsest of languages, and this area was no exception. The post-war Norwegian expedition played a key role in consolidating this system. Its teams reviewed the German photographs and compared them with their own ground observations. Where the Germans had identified a massif, the Norwegians established camps and conducted direct measurements. This verification gave weight to several of the proposed names. They were not armchair fantasies, they were practical references for navigation and geodesy. In the 1950s, international cartography began to incorporate this information. The sheets covering Queen Maud Land displayed mountain ranges with names that revealed their origin. Some honored technicians and pilots, while others reflected translated descriptive terms. In this way, a few months of exploration left a lasting imprint on the language of polar maps. This process shows two things. First, the expedition provided real data about the terrain. Second, its material legacy was limited. No ruins or structures appeared. What remained were names, coordinates, and lines on paper. The permanence of the toponymy contrasts sharply with the total absence of physical traces attributable to a prolonged presence. Over time, that list of names became a resource for researchers and polar mountaineers. Even in the satellite era, identifying a peak by name on a map remains essential for coordinating scientific campaigns. German-rooted toponyms coexist in these schemes with Norwegian, Russian, British, and Indian names. Antarctica thus reflects a history of successive explorations. However, in the realm of popular dissemination, another interpretation emerged. Some authors began presenting these names as implicit evidence of a deeper, longer-lasting German presence. They argued that no one bothers naming mountains without a larger plan to use them. The available documentation tells a different story. Names arise from the normal logic of any reconnaissance expedition: observe, measure, name, and move on. This difference in interpretation helped fuel the myth. In conspiracy narratives, mountain ranges and peaks with German names were transformed into veiled references to base entrances or restricted access sectors. In reality, they were landmarks chosen for their visibility and cartographic utility. Elevations rising from the ice, visible from afar, ideal for plotting flight lines or delimiting study zones. The working files of the German cartographers reinforce this sober view. The notes speak of prominent features and control points. They make no mention of tunnels or facilities. The language is technical, describing shadow, slope, estimated altitude, and relationship to nearby glaciers. Proper names appear as a subsequent, almost administrative, layer on top of this physical dataset. The partial adoption of these toponyms by countries that were Germany's wartime enemies is also significant. Norway, which suffered occupation, had no hesitation in preserving or adjusting several names proposed by the Schwabenland expedition. The reason was simple. They were useful and already circulating in the polar community. Science and field practice prevailed over the original political intent. Fats, whales, and strategy in Goering's papers. During the war, Germany needed fats for food, detergents, and industrial lubricants. The country was not self-sufficient. It relied on imports that could be cut off in the event of war. This issue appears repeatedly in the documents of the 4-year plan. Hermann Goering coordinated the plan. Under his command worked economists, chemical industry technicians, and officers of the Kriegsmarine. Their reports reveal a basic concern: securing their own sources of raw materials. Among these, whale oil held an important place. It was one of the bases for producing margarine and other products that substituted for traditional lard. In the 1930s, the large whaling fleets operated in the South Atlantic and around Antarctica. Norway and the United Kingdom dominated this business. They controlled factory ships, hunting fleets, and processing rights. Germany purchased much of the oil it needed. This created vulnerability. A blockade could deprive the industry of a key part of its production chain. For this reason, Germany began considering the feasibility of a whaling fleet under its own flag, possible ports or support points in the South Atlantic, and the value of the Antarctic coast as a seasonal operational area. The recovered reports mention the route around the Cape of Good Hope. They highlight the importance of South Georgia and other points in the Southern Ocean. They stress that in case of conflict, access to these waters would depend on agreements or on their own naval capabilities. In this framework, having a studied and charted coastal sector could be an advantage, not immediate but potential. The expedition had to answer several questions. What ice thicknesses were found near the coast? How long the season of relatively ice-free waters lasted, and what wind and sea conditions the ships could expect. All of this translated into simple calculations: possible hunting days, risks of being trapped in ice, operational costs versus foreign suppliers. The Luftwaffe technicians provided another angle. The experience of launching seaplanes from a ship demonstrated that extensive reconnaissance could be conducted without the need for large land bases. Internal reports emphasized this point. With a suitable vessel, fuel, and proper logistics, it was possible to explore and monitor a vast area without building anything permanent on the ice. There were no shortage of more ambitious ideas. Some memoranda suggest that in the long term, automatic or semi-permanent meteorological stations could be installed on sub-Antarctic islands or on accessible stretches of coast. The goal was not to create hidden cities. It was to feed data to the operations of the Navy and the Luftwaffe in the South Atlantic: meteorology, ice, currents, information useful for maritime warfare. At the same time, economic planners ran the numbers. How many factory ships would be needed, what volume of catches would make the investment profitable, and what impact reducing purchases from Norwegian or British suppliers would have on the balance of payments. In the documents, Antarctica appeared as a piece in a global strategy of import substitution. None of this was realized as planned. War broke out before Germany could develop a large-scale whaling fleet of its own. Resources were concentrated on other priorities: tanks, planes, submarines. Projects for the far south were frozen. What survived was the archive, photos, maps, and studies, and a general notion in the regime's leadership that the South Atlantic was a zone of military and economic interest. This vision was also reflected in naval plans. The Kriegsmarine considered using the South Atlantic as an operational area for raiders, auxiliary cruisers, and submarines. Ships such as the Admiral Graf Spee operated in these waters, not for Antarctica itself, but for the surrounding trade routes, traffic between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, carrying fuels and raw materials. Operation Tabarin, the silent British response. In London, the news of the German expedition did not go unnoticed. British intelligence closely followed every detail about the Schwabenland. They took note of the flights, the photographs, the sector the Germans called Neuschwabenland, and of something broader: the Reich's growing interest in the South Atlantic. For the United Kingdom, that area was strategic. It secured routes to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, allowed control over access to raw materials, and reinforced claims over parts of Antarctica and the sub-Antarctic islands. During the war, any movement by an enemy power near these points was concerning, not just because of Antarctica itself, but also because of the surrounding seas. In 1943, while the conflict raged in Europe and North Africa, a discreet decision was made to create an operation aimed at strengthening the British presence in the far south. It was not announced in the press nor presented as a major campaign. It was designed as a small, almost clandestine mission, given the codename Tabarin. Operation Tabarin combined science and warfare. Geologists, meteorologists, and biologists would travel, but all under military command. Their tasks were twofold. On one hand, to establish research stations on the Antarctic Peninsula and nearby islands. On the other, to monitor maritime routes, track ship movements, and consolidate British territorial claims. The ships that carried the first teams were modest, nothing like large combat fleets. They transported wood, fuel, provisions, and materials to build huts along with radios and observation equipment. Campaign diaries describe a clear objective: to establish permanent bases that would operate year-round, even in winter, demonstrating continuous presence on the ground. Priority was given to sites where previous expeditions had left shelters or relatively protected anchorages, bays with reasonable access to open sea, yet sheltered from the harshest winds. Each base required a minimum of security so that a small team could survive months in isolation. Once ashore, teams built wooden huts on stilts, reinforced roofs against snow, stacked fuel barrels, and prepared reserve supply depots in case a harsh winter cut off contact with the outside. Radio antennas became the essential connection to British authorities, allowing the transmission of weather reports, alerts about distant ships, and updates on the health of the crews. In parallel, scientists took samples, measured temperatures, recorded winds, and described local fauna and geology. Each station was both a laboratory and a military observation post. Meteorological information had immediate value for the navigation of the Royal Navy and the Air Force, while field data reinforced the argument that the United Kingdom was not only claiming the region but also occupying and studying it. The reports from the time show that concern over an actual German presence on the peninsula was limited. No bases or landings were detected. What was feared, however, was the use of remote islands as support points for raiders or submarines. Tabarin helped cover that gap. A couple of men with binoculars and a radio could monitor wide sectors of sea and report suspicious movements. Daily life at the bases was harsh: long winters, darkness, snowstorms. Supply depended on a few windows of good weather. Crews had to be self-sufficient, repairing generators, cutting ice for water, keeping structures standing against the wind. In that context, every nail, plank, and drum that arrived by ship was valuable. Over time, Operation Tabarin established an initial network of installations that would later be integrated into post-war scientific programs. Some bases were transformed into permanent stations, others were abandoned. Their remains were scattered across various bays and capes of the Antarctic Peninsula, ruined huts, rusted tanks, and fallen masts and antennas. Decades later, these remains were photographed and catalogued as part of Antarctic historical heritage, but they were also used in another way. Some photos circulated without context, showing isolated huts, partially buried structures in the snow, and corroded metal fragments. Sensationalist authors presented them as evidence of former German bases. In reality, the Tabarin documentation allows each of these constructions to be traced. It is known when they were built, who lived there, what experiments were conducted, and when they were closed. Everything is recorded in campaign diaries, supply lists, and maintenance sheets. The operations archive tells a precise story. There is no room to imagine a hidden German presence within those same walls. Remains on the peninsula, Allied traces turned into Nazi evidence. Over time, what Operation Tabarin and other Allied missions left on the Antarctic Peninsula became something else. At first, they were simply remnants: worn wooden huts, dented fuel tanks, fallen antennas, or debris accumulated over years of use. Later, they became pieces of polar history, and eventually, evidence of something that never happened. The first systematic inspections arrived in the post-war years. Teams from Britain, Chile, Argentina, and other countries visited the old bases. They examined the structures, recorded the condition of the buildings, and decided which would remain active and which would be abandoned. Reports described each shelter in detail: number of huts, date of construction, stored materials. The typical remains of these installations followed a pattern: metal barrels stacked near the coast, sleds and wooden frames, corrugated sheets used as roofs, iron stoves, empty ammunition boxes repurposed as containers, exposed electrical wiring. All of this spoke of daily life in a harsh environment. In many bases, personal items were also found: glass bottles, crushed cans, books deteriorated by moisture, ceramic plates, mirrors, kitchen utensils. Nothing of this indicated a secret presence. It was the normal trace of small communities that had spent 1 or 2 isolated winters with limited resources. As the decades passed, perceptions of these remains changed. Organizations dedicated to preserving Antarctic heritage began cataloging them, creating inventories, assigning numbers to each structure, and deciding what should be preserved as testimony of the first permanent human presence in certain areas. Some huts were reinforced, while others were left as they were, but with explanatory signs. This work left a clear documentary trace. Each base had a history. It was known who had founded it, which country administered it, what scientific campaigns had been conducted, and when it had been closed. In many cases, period photographs showed the same structures in good condition, occupied by sailors and scientists. Continuity was visible. At the same time, the Antarctic landscape became a stage for loose photographs and decontextualized stories. Tourists, modern crews, and amateur adventurers began sharing images of abandoned huts and rusted tanks. In these photos, taken without background information, it was easy to project any story. A suggestive caption could transform a British shelter into a facility of unknown origin. Modern inspections, carried out by international teams, reinforced this clarity. Archaeologists and conservationists walked among these remains with a different perspective. For them, every nail, plank, and paint mark said something concrete about its origin: types of saw, industrial standards, drum formats. All of this allows one to distinguish a construction from the 1940s from one built in the 1970s, and above all, it allows researchers to link it to the countries that operated there at each moment. In this material reading, the German footprint is entirely absent on the peninsula. British, Chilean, Argentine, and US signatures appear. Plaques bearing expedition names and emblems of scientific programs appear. But there are no German signs from the Nazi era, no Kriegsmarine manuals forgotten in a corner, and no equipment pieces matching Reich military standards. Serious historical studies follow a different path. They start from the documentary record, cross-referencing campaign diaries, logistical reports, and official photographs. Then they go into the field and compare. What is observed matches what is described. Where a Tabarin report mentions a base in a specific bay, compatible remains are found. Where reports indicate the absence of installations, the landscape appears empty. A massive fleet on the ice, Operation High Jump. By 1946, the war had ended, but the world remained militarized. The United States had a massive navy, ships, aircraft, and personnel who had learned to fight in every ocean. In this context, a peculiar operation was launched. It was not intended to attack anyone. Its purpose was to test how a fleet would function in the planet's most hostile environment. It was called Operation High Jump. Command was given to Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a central figure in American polar exploration. Around him, an impressive force was organized. 13 ships, more than 4,000 men, carrier-based aircraft, helicopters, scientific teams, and equipment to set up camps on the ice. In practice, it was a small armada directed at the White Continent. The official objectives were clear on paper: train troops and crews in extreme weather operations, test equipment, clothing, and vehicles in intense cold, gather data on meteorological, ice, and navigational conditions, and update coastal maps with modern aerial photography. Antarctica provided an ideal setting to rehearse the logistics of a potential future war in polar regions. The fleet departed from the United States toward the austral summer of 1946 to 1947. The plan was to take advantage of the season with the least ice in the Ross Sea and other sectors. The ships included escort carriers, icebreakers, supply vessels, and a mothership for seaplanes. On board were sailors, pilots, meteorologists, photographers, and medical personnel. The scale was far greater than any previous Antarctic operation. As the force moved south, temperatures dropped, winds increased, and the sea filled with drifting ice blocks. Contemporary reports describe complex maneuvers to maintain the fleet's formation. The icebreaker led the way, and the other ships followed carefully. A single mistake could mean hull damage or lost propellers. Once minimal conditions allowed, flights began. Aircraft with skis took off from improvised ice runways while others launched from carriers. Their mission was to photograph broad swaths of the Antarctic coastline, taking sequential images in the style of the German expedition years earlier, but using more modern cameras and with a much greater operational range. The amount of material obtained was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of coast and ice shelves were documented. These photographs would later be used to update naval charts and support future scientific campaigns. Meteorological and oceanographic data were also collected, which proved useful for better understanding the polar climate and navigation hazards. High jump was not without problems. There were aviation accidents. Several planes crashed during takeoffs or landings under difficult conditions. Some were lost in the ice. Crew members died. There was also damage to ships caused by ice pressure and severe storms. The final tally included human and material losses, a reminder of how dangerous it was to operate on the White Continent, even without an enemy. Decades later, this premature withdrawal would be portrayed in some accounts as the result of an encounter with hidden forces. In some cases, remnants of German units were mentioned, in others, strange technologies. Official documents tell a different story. They mention no combat, no contact with enemies, only storms, ice, accidents, and technical problems. Crew and officer personal diaries reinforce this picture. They focus on the cold, exhaustion, and the tension of maneuvering large ships among ice floes. They complain of frozen equipment, failing engines, and metal parts breaking. For many, the enemy was the environment. The challenge was to survive the combination of sea, wind, and ice. From a military perspective, high jump left several lessons. It confirmed that operating large naval groups near the Antarctic continent was possible but very costly. It demonstrated the limits of carriers and conventional aircraft in polar conditions. It highlighted the need for equipment designed for extreme cold and emphasized the importance of high-quality meteorological and ice information. From the perspective of legend, however, the operation provided perfect material for the imagination: a massive fleet, a remote setting, deadly accidents, a premature withdrawal, and technical reports little known to the general public. On this basis, it was relatively easy to construct a narrative of a secret mission against an invisible enemy. Antarctica became an ideal stage for stories blending Nazis, hidden bases, and unknown forces. U-530 and U-977, Atlantic suspicions, no stop on the ice. In May 1945, the Third Reich collapsed. German surrender was signed. But in the ocean, submarines were still at sea that had not received clear orders. Others had received them but chose not to obey immediately. Among these were U-530 and U-977. U-530, commanded by Otto Wermuth, was a Type 9C/40 submarine with long range. It had operated in the Western Atlantic. Its final orders were to attack Allied shipping near the US coast. In the last days of the war, it had almost no targets left. Allied naval dominance was overwhelming. When news of the surrender arrived, Wermuth made a risky decision. He did not surrender at the nearest Allied port. Instead, he sailed south, aiming for Argentina, where, in theory, he could expect a less hostile reception than in British or American hands. During the journey, the crew destroyed sensitive documents and also dumped torpedoes and ammunition into the sea. They did not want to arrive with weapons ready for combat, knowing it would immediately raise suspicions. The voyage was long and tense. They avoided main shipping routes and spent many days partially submerged using the snorkel. On July 10, 1945, U-530 appeared off Mar del Plata. The submarine surfaced, hoisted a white flag, and surrendered to the Argentine Navy. News spread quickly. A U-boat had arrived on the South American coast weeks after the end of the war. Questions arose immediately. The United States and the United Kingdom sent interrogation teams. They wanted to know why the vessel had arrived so late, what route it had taken, and whether it carried important passengers or special cargo. Theories flourished simultaneously: Hitler escaping, hidden officials, gold or secret documents, even a possible stop in Antarctica. Interrogations were systematic. The commander and officers were interviewed separately. Their accounts were compared, and the submarine was examined piece by piece. No extra passengers were found, only the regular crew. There was no valuable cargo, nor provisions sufficient to sustain a prolonged stop on a remote coast. Weymouth's declared route was straightforward, from the North Atlantic to the western sector, then southward, always in open water. No port calls, no approach to the Antarctic coast. The available fuel matched this itinerary, and the sea and weather conditions during those weeks supported it. Allied services considered this version plausible. The case of U-977 was similar, yet even more controversial. Under the command of Heinz Schäfer, it departed Kristiansand on May 2, 1945. It was also a Type 7 submarine, also operating in the Atlantic. Like other commanders, Schäfer hesitated between obeying the surrender order or seeking an alternative course. Part of the crew decided not to join the venture. Schäfer disembarked several men on the Norwegian coast before setting off westward. With the remaining crew, he headed into the Atlantic. The account he would later give described a long journey, almost continuously submerged, using the snorkel for weeks to avoid Allied aircraft and ships. U-977 arrived in Argentina on August 17, 1945, again at Mar del Plata. Again, it caused surprise. 3 months had passed since the official end of the war in Europe. Suspicions immediately arose. Where had this submarine been all that time? The Allies repeated their procedure: extensive interrogations, thorough inspection of the hull and compartments, checking remaining fuel and analyzing consumed provisions. The key question was the same: were there any secret landings? The reports reflect a consistent conclusion. There's no evidence of a stop in Antarctica. No coastal ice marks appear on the hull to suggest maneuvers near ice barriers. There are no abnormal fuel consumptions indicating extreme detours southward. The version most compatible with the data is a long, zigzagging voyage in open water, always in the Atlantic. Suspicions about important passengers were also unconfirmed. Mordheim and the expeditions returning to German territory. After the war, the Queen Maud land sector remained, for the most part, a blank space. Germany was no longer in a position to return, but other countries were. Norway, the United Kingdom and Sweden decided to organize a joint expedition. They wanted to study the interior ice and also strengthen their interests in the region that the Schwabenland had photographed a few years earlier. Thus was born the Norwegian-British-Swedish Antarctic Expedition. Its English acronym, NBSAE, would appear in many reports. The goal was to establish a base in the interior of the continent, on the ice shelf, and maintain it for several years. This was not a short summer trip. It was about living there under extreme conditions to rigorously measure the climate and ice dynamics. The chosen base was named Mordheim. It was located on the coast of Queen Maud Land, on a relatively stable ice shelf. From there, expeditions could be launched inland using sleds and later snow vehicles. The site selection combined caution and ambition, close enough to the sea to be accessible, yet far enough inland to represent the typical Antarctic interior environment. The expedition operated between 1949 and 1952. During those years, teams from the 3 countries shared huts, duties, and risks. They built semi-buried wooden cabins for wind protection, dug tunnels in the snow to store provisions and fuel, and erected masts with meteorological instruments. They installed and monitored measuring equipment even in the heart of the polar winter, with extreme temperatures and near total darkness. One of the central objectives was to understand ice behavior. To achieve this, scientists measured snow accumulation, ice shelf movement, and internal structure. They drilled boreholes, inserted instruments, and marked stakes to check at regular intervals. This patient routine produced datasets that would help explain how the ice sheet flows toward the sea. At the same time, traditional topographic work was conducted. Heights of nearby hills and mountains were measured, astronomical coordinates determined, and relief profiles beneath the snow were traced. The Norwegians, with their extensive polar experience, were key in these tasks. They compared what they observed with maps created from the 1938 to 1939 German aerial photographs, adjusted positions, corrected errors, and confirmed many features previously identified from the air. Daily life at Mordheim left a very detailed documentary record: personal diaries, scientific reports, material inventories, and photographs of the cabin interiors and the camp as seen from the ice. Many images show Norwegian, British, and Swedish flags, but also landscapes reminiscent of the photos taken by the Schwabenland. The same plateaus, the same lines of ice cliffs, this time seen from the ground. The NBSAE campaigns also used light aircraft for reconnaissance. Short flights departed from Maudheim, photographing the interior mountain ranges. These images completed the coverage that the Germans had begun a decade earlier. By combining both sets, cartographers produced much more accurate maps of the sector. The mountains with German names were now tied to precisely defined coordinates. When the NBSAE scientists described the surroundings of the base, they emphasized one point: it was an environment extremely uniform from a human perspective, ice in all directions, a low horizon without notable features, except where underlying terrain caused the ice to fracture. Any artificial structure, no matter how small, would have stood out immediately against this uniformity. The expedition did not limit itself to the Maudheim area. Journeys were organized inland using dog sleds and tracked vehicles. Fuel and supply depots were established along the way, and routes were marked with flags and stakes. Everything was meticulously recorded: coordinates, dates, distances traveled. These data allow today for the reconstruction of the network of routes across the eastern Antarctic sector explored by the Norwegians. At no point along these routes were there traces of prior activity that could be attributed to the Reich. No buried depots or remnants of materials manufactured in Germany before 1945 were found. The only German legacy recognized by the teams consisted of some names on maps and the memory of the Schwabenland aerial expedition. When the NBSAE concluded, Maudheim was abandoned. Some of the structures remained on site, partially buried by snow. Over the years, the ice incorporated these remains, turning them into another layer of human history on the continent. Their origin, however, is perfectly documented. Plans, photographs, and diaries leave no ambiguity about who built them and for what purpose. Beneath the ice, only mountains. At the time of Maudheim, exploring the interior of the continent was slow. Travel had to be made with sleds. Measurements were taken by hand. The terrain hidden beneath hundreds of meters of snow had to be inferred. This changed with the development of polar geophysics. Starting in the 1950s and 1960s, Antarctica began to be seen from the inside. First came simple seismic methods. Controlled explosions were set off, and the waves traveling through the ice and ground, as well as the time they took to return, were measured. From this data, the thickness of the ice layer could be calculated. Vertical profiles were drawn, showing where the ice was denser, where it rested on rock, or where there was no solid terrain. Then a tool arrived that transformed exploration: ice-penetrating radar. Antennas mounted on planes or snow vehicles emitted pulses that passed through the ice layer, bounced off rock or internal transitions, and returned to the receiver. The return time was converted into depth. In this way, cross-sections of the ice sheet interior were obtained over vast areas. In the region of Queen Maud Land, including the area the Germans called Neuschwabenland, these surveys were repeated for decades. Aircraft from different national programs flew parallel lines again and again. The data accumulated. Each radar profile revealed an image: a white roof above, an irregular base below, valleys, peaks, and rock plateaus hidden beneath the ice. The results revealed a surprising landscape. It was not a flat bottom. Beneath the ice layer lay entire mountain ranges. The most famous is the subglacial mountain system crossing part of East Antarctica, buried peaks that never break the surface, deep valleys filled with ice. In some areas, basins contain subglacial lakes of liquid water, isolated for thousands of years. The logic of this data is clear. If large artificial structures existed, made of materials different from rock and ice, they would alter these signals. They would produce anomalous reflections, flat surfaces where none exist, cavities or detectable voids. In the profiles obtained in the Neuschwabenland region, none of this appears. What is visible is continuous natural terrain. In addition to radar, gravimetric measurements were used. Sensors recorded small variations in gravity according to the density of the subsurface. Rock, ice, water, sediment deposits, each leaves a distinct signature. Along the eastern coast, these gravity maps show geological structures consistent with mountain ranges and ancient basins. They do not show masses of concrete or steel buried underground. No extensive voids indicate underground cities. Another key tool was the magnetometer. It measures variations in the local magnetic field. It is used to map rock types and to detect large amounts of metal. Flights crossing the eastern sector of Antarctica collected this data. Again, the result was a pattern consistent with bedrock, magmatic intrusions, and deep tectonic structures. Nothing resembling bunkers or massive installations appeared. With the advancement of deep drilling, some areas of East Antarctica were also studied using ice cores, large cylinders extracted from the surface down to hundreds or thousands of meters. Each core is a climate archive: annual layers, dust, air bubbles, volcanic signals. These drillings show continuity. They are not interrupted by artificial tunnels or concrete ceilings. They end where a natural core should end, in the rock. In the region associated with the Schwabenland flights, the picture emerging from all these methods is consistent. A thick ice sheet rests on buried mountains. Some peaks emerge, forming nunataks. Others are completely buried. Between them, valleys channel ice flow toward the coast. In specific areas, the ice base approaches the melting pressure, allowing for liquid water, but always as part of natural systems. Modern mapping of this subsurface has been integrated into numerical models, programs that simulate how the ice moves, how ice shelves respond to temperature changes, and how glaciers may evolve under global warming. In these simulations, the presence of large artificial cavities would be a significant factor. There is no need to include them. There is no evidence that they exist. Georg Forster, Germany's return to the oasis. In 1974, the German Democratic Republic joined the Antarctic Treaty System. This opened a political door. To have full voice in decisions regarding the continent, it needed to demonstrate substantial interest in scientific research there. A clear way to achieve this was to operate its own permanent station. The opportunity lay on the coast of Queen Maud Land. The Soviets maintained the Novolazarevskaya station in the Schirmacher Oasis. This rocky, ice-free strip, discovered by the 1938 expedition, offered solid ground, fresh water, and relatively easy access from the sea. On April 21, 1976, the German component of a shared complex with the Soviet station was activated. About 2 kilometers from Novolazarevskaya, prefabricated modules were erected. This was the seed of Germany's own station. Over time, the facility would become administratively independent and receive a symbolic name, Georg Forster. The homage was not accidental. Georg Forster had accompanied James Cook on his voyages. According to tradition, he was the first German to set foot in the southern lands on the South Georgia Islands in 1775. An enlightened naturalist associated with exploration and science, far removed from the military imagination of the Reich. The station began modestly, a handful of metal and wooden modules on bare rock, antennas, fuel depots, and small laboratories. In the winter of 1976, 6 men formed the first overwintering crew, spending the full year there. Their duties were to maintain equipment, record data, and ensure the base's survival under harsh conditions. The scientific program focused on the upper atmosphere, aurora observations, geomagnetic measurements, and meteorology. Starting in 1985, a key activity was added: ozone sounding using balloons. These measurements helped document the Antarctic ozone hole, a discovery that would shape late 20th century climate science. At the same time, the station served a political purpose. Its continuous operation allowed the GDR to achieve consultative status in the Antarctic Treaty by the late 1980s. This category granted the right to participate in decisions on environmental protection, scientific use, and the continent's future. Presence in the Schirmacher Oasis made the GDR a recognized polar actor alongside powers such as the USSR, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Daily life at Georg Forster followed patterns already established at other Antarctic stations. Winters were spent with a small, overwintering crew, while summers saw rotating teams of researchers. Routines included maintenance of generators, antennas, and heating systems. Daily walks were made to measure snow, lake ice, and meteorological parameters. The dark rock surrounding the station, dotted with more than 100 freshwater lakes, provided an open-air laboratory for geologists and biologists. With German reunification in 1990, the situation changed. The new Germany inherited the responsibilities and programs of the former GDR. For a time, the station continued operating under unified management. The last full winter over took place in 1991 to 1992. In February 1993, regular operations were suspended. One problem remained: the material legacy. By the early 1990s, parts of the Schirmacher oasis were among the most polluted areas in Antarctica. Metal debris, tanks, and remnants of both the former East German and Russian stations had accumulated over decades. Between 1993 and 1996, a joint German-Russian cleanup project was organized. Teams from the Alfred Wegener Institute and the Russian Polar Research Institute dismantled the station piece by piece. Over 1,000 tons of scrap and waste, including residues from Novolazarevskaya, were removed from the area, shipped off the continent in compliance with the Antarctic Treaty Environmental Protocol. When the dismantling was completed, no building remained standing. Only a rock with a bronze plaque marked the site. It reads, Antarctic Station Georg Forster, 70 degrees 46 minutes 39 seconds south, 11 degrees 51 minutes 3 seconds east von 1976 bis 1996. This location was proposed by Germany as Historic Site and Monument number 87 under the Antarctic Treaty System, with the designation becoming official in 2013. In the same oasis that some stories turned into a secret Reich refuge, the only visible German trace today is this simple plaque, a reminder of a Cold War scientific station and of the later efforts to repair the environmental impact. From archive to myth. After the war, the documents from the 1938 Schwabenland expedition were scattered. Photographs were stored in military archives. Maps were in geographic institutes. Reports sat in depots that no one ever checked. To governments, it was technical material. To the general public, it almost didn't exist. In the 1950s and 1960s, attention focused elsewhere. European reconstruction, the Cold War, the nuclear race. Antarctica appeared in the news mainly as the stage for treaties and international science, not as a refuge for fleeing Nazis. The Schwabenland expedition received barely a mention in specialized studies. The shift began when the first books appeared blending espionage, the flight of Nazi officials, and remote oceans. The starting point was real. Many Nazis did escape. Some reached South America, others died without being captured. On that foundation, some authors began to stretch the narrative. If there were escape networks to Argentina, why not imagine even more remote refugees? Antarctica offered the perfect stage: distant, hard to verify, ice-covered, and with a prior German expedition about which almost no one knew details. It only took connecting two pieces: the Schwabenland's journey and the late arrival of the submarines U-530 and U-977. The result was a first narrative. Submarines that didn't just head to Mar del Plata. They had supposedly stopped at an intermediate point, a remote coastal sector, some location in the region photographed in 1939. In this construction, facts were reorganized. The German flights were no longer whaling and cartographic studies. They became reconnaissance missions to select the site of a future base. Aluminum arrows marked secret entrances. The Schirmacher oasis ceased to be a geographic accident and became a temperate area suitable for tunnels and hangars. Into this mix came Operation High Jump, a great fleet, accidents, an early withdrawal, technical reports little known to the public. For readers of pamphlets and sensationalist magazines, it was the ideal ingredient. The United States had not gone to train troops, it had gone to attack a German base. The absence of combat in the official documents was reinterpreted as evidence of a cover-up. The Antarctic Peninsula and its allied bases also entered the narrative. The huts of Operation Tabarin, the abandoned British structures, the fuel depots and scrap metal were presented as remnants of German installations. Any reference to campaign diaries, supply lists, or period photographs showing British and Chilean flags was omitted. The images floated without context, ready to receive any label. In the 1970s and 1980s, the theories became bolder. To the final refuge scheme were added elements of science fiction, advanced weapons, secret projects revived in the ice, and later even flying objects of German design. Antarctica became a stage where anything that had no place in historical reality could fit. The 1938 expedition helped give the story a veneer of plausibility. There were photographs, there was a German name on the maps, there was a real oasis, there were submarines that had sailed south. All of that was true. The leap occurred when these facts were glued together without evidence. Where there were photos, there were claimed constructions. Where there was ice, there were tunnels. Where there was an oasis, there was a city. Meanwhile, academic research followed a different path. Polar historians, specialists in the Kriegsmarine, and experts on the Third Reich's economy reviewed the same archives. They read memoranda about whale oil, not underground bases. They examined submarine cargo lists, not inventories of gold or relics. They found maps, but no trace of plans for permanent colonization on the ice. When these studies began to be published, they encountered a perception problem. Rigorous works circulated in specialized journals with limited reach, while conspiracy books sold in kiosks and airports. They offered a simple and thrilling narrative: an enemy that had not disappeared, a secret hidden beyond the reach of justice, a map full of gaps that anyone could fill. Popular culture did the rest. Films, novels, and comics incorporated the idea of hidden bases in remote locations. Antarctica was not always explicitly mentioned. Sometimes the setting was generic, but the imagery took root. Impossible bunkers, forgotten laboratories, clandestine communities surviving at the far southern edge, far from any law. With the advent of the internet, the cycle accelerated. Old photos without captions began circulating in forums. Maps taken out of context were shared as evidence. Any smudge in a satellite image could, with a red circle, become a suspicious entrance. Complete documents with signatures, dates, and technical descriptions were relegated to digital archives few people consulted. At the same time, a consensus was forming in the academic world. The 1938 German expedition was a reconnaissance mission focused on economic and geographic information. The Reich's naval presence in the South Atlantic did not include Antarctic bases. The submarines that arrived in Argentina made no stops on the ice. Later, major operations by Allied powers found no hidden structures in the region. The tangible legacy was cartographic, not military. That gap between historical consensus and popular narrative is at the core of the issue. On one side, there are archives, measurements, diaries, and maps. On the other, stories that mix real fragments with unsupported assumptions. To complete the picture, one must look at how contemporary Antarctic research treats all this material. What reviews have been conducted, what questions have been clarified, and what mysteries remain, even if they no longer involve bunkers or phantom submarines. What research says today. Today, the question is no longer what the Nazis might have hidden in Antarctica. The question is what remains in the archives and in the ice. Historians, geographers, and polar specialists have spent decades reviewing documents, photographs, and geophysical data. The result is a far clearer picture than existed when the legends were born. A turning point was the work of Colin Summerhays, a marine geologist connected to polar research. His study examined in detail the 1938 German expedition, Operation Tabarin, Operation High Jump, and the late arrival of the U-boats in Argentina. He cross-referenced documents from German, British, US, and Argentine archives. The conclusion is straightforward. There is no trace of a permanent Nazi base in Antarctica. Recent work on the German Antarctic expedition concurs with this assessment. It shows that the main objective was economic: securing sources of whale oil, studying potential zones for a German whaling fleet, and evaluating strategic advantages in the South Atlantic, without any concrete plans for mass colonization of the ice. The expedition mapped a large sector named Neuschwabenland and evaluated the theoretical possibility of claiming it in the future. The war left it on paper. At the same time, historiography on Antarctica during World War II has clarified the role of Allied operations. Tabarin is now understood as a British operation combining sovereignty and surveillance with a strong scientific component aimed at consolidating presence on the peninsula and surrounding islands. The bases it established are the direct origin of programs like the British Antarctic Survey. High Jump is analysed as a large-scale US naval and logistical exercise designed to train troops, test equipment in extreme cold, update maps, and evaluate possible sites for future scientific bases. None of these operations reported finding German installations on the continent. Studies of geodesy and photogrammetry from the German expedition add another layer. They show how the 11,600 photos were integrated into later cartographic work and helped improve knowledge of the coastal relief and certain interior mountain ranges. That was the real contribution. Modern geophysics completed the picture. Radar profiles, gravimetric and magnetometric measurements, and deep drilling have allowed the reconstruction of Queen Maud Land's terrain beneath the ice. What appears are subglacial mountain ranges, basins, and possible buried lakes, all of natural origin. There is no evidence consistent with large hidden artificial structures in the area. Models using these data to simulate ice flow do not require anomalous cavities to explain its behavior. Meanwhile, scientific outreach and some general media have made efforts to convey this consensus to the public. Articles in journals such as Polar Record and reviews in outlets like Nature and Popular Mechanics explain in accessible terms how the legend of a Nazi base arose and why it does not hold up against the documentary evidence. They emphasize that precisely because the myth was persistent, dedicated academic work was required to dismantle it point by point. The current political framework is also important. The Antarctic Treaty System, in force since 1961, freezes territorial claims, prohibits military activity, and dedicates the continent to science and international cooperation. In this context, the idea of a secret base from a defeated power decades ago does not fit legally or logistically. Regarding the German presence, the history is well documented. A reconnaissance expedition in 1938 to 1939, followed by decades of absence, and later a return under divided Germany, with the GDR establishing the Georg Forster station in the Schirmacher Oasis during the Cold War. That station was dismantled in a controlled manner in the 1990s. Today, only a plaque remains, recognized as a historic site. Nothing more. From a research perspective, current interest has shifted elsewhere. The same sector, once associated with myths of secret refugees, is now key for studying the stability of ice shelves, the behavior of the East Antarctic ice sheet, and Antarctica's role in the global climate system. The remaining mysteries concern melt rates, glacier dynamics, and future sea level rise, not vanished submarines. There is one final layer, less geographic and more cultural. The story of the supposed Nazi base in Antarctica has become a classic example of how isolated facts can be combined to construct an appealing narrative. A real expedition, submarines arriving late at port, secret military operations that were actually documented, and abandoned Allied base remnants taken out of context. Onto this mix, fears, fantasies, and mistrust are projected. In the end, the findings linked to Nazi Germany in the far south are quite different. A sector of the continent photographed in detail for the first time, a rocky oasis later hosting research stations, mountains that still carry German names on maps, an archive of photos and maps that aided subsequent explorers, and a persistent legend that tells us more about how we search for secrets than about what actually happened on the ice.